A young woman falls to her death from a rugged California cliff. Months after she's buried, an investigator suspects she was pushed. Researchers try to determine a woman's cause of death 3,000 years after she died. How can they perform an autopsy without destroying her fragile, mummified shell? To catch a murderer, detectives must prove that a few splinters of bone are the remains of a woman who disappeared 2 years earlier. Time doesn't heal all wounds, a fact that keeps relentless detectives on the trail of cold or forgotten cases. With cutting-edge technology, forensic experts are able to travel back in time, months, years, or millennia, to coax mysteries out of the grave. From San Diego to San Francisco, California's coastal highways are some of the most magnificent drives in the world. Heading north, stretches of glittering sand and crowded freeways gradually give way to a vastly different landscape. As Highway 1 winds through the Monterey Peninsula, mountains collide with the sea in a majestic alliance of power and beauty. In Big Sur, California, the huge sky and boundless Pacific Ocean seduce visitors to the edge of the dizzying cliffs for a breathtaking view of the edge of the world and a snapshot by which to remember it. But sometimes the pull is too strong. On April 2nd, 1987, the Monterey County Sheriff's Department received a phone call that something horrible had happened at the Seal Beach Overlook. The body of a 20-year-old woman named Dina Wilde was lying near the base of a 600-foot precipice. It was not the first time the search and rescue squad had been dispatched to collect the remains of a victim lured too close to the edge. A deputy from the sheriff's office questioned the middle-aged couple waiting at the scene. They were Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, tourists from San Diego. They told the officer that their young companion had tumbled over silently when they weren't looking. The rescue squad retrieved the lifeless body from the bottom of the cliff. After a cursory examination by the coroner, Dina Wilde was returned to her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, and buried. At the Second Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Dina Wilde's freak accident was still on people's minds months after she'd been buried. When services ended one Sunday, Dina's mother, Bobby Roberts, approached a lawyer named Steve Keeney. She needed help collecting insurance money after her daughter's death.
She wanted to collect burial insurance that she had as part of her benefits as a teacher, and the insurance company had told her no. We told her that sometimes a letter from a law firm cuts through the red tape, we'd give it a try.
Keeney knew that Bobby could really use the $3,500. He agreed to make a few phone calls for her on his own time. Keeney called Bobby's insurance company and uncovered the source of the holdup. They had never received Dina's death certificate. Keeney then called the Monterey coroner's office requesting a copy of the death certificate. But when the document arrived, it listed the cause of death as pending. Because Dina's death was presumed to be an accident, the rescue team had done little beyond retrieving the body. No evidence was collected, no photographs were taken. The body was sent to the Monterey coroner's office. Its analysis found no hint of foul play. Bobby Roberts' simple request was snowballing into a time-consuming tangle of bureaucracy. But Keeney pressed on. He contacted Monterey law enforcement only to discover that the case was in limbo. The certificate couldn't be issued until cause of death was determined, but the sheriff's department had, for all intents and purposes, dropped the case for lack of evidence. Dina had been dead for months. What could be holding things up? Keeney called Bobby's insurance company again to see if there was some way of expediting Bobby's payment.
When we called back, we stumbled into a fact that we never expected. That was that there was life insurance on Dina in someone else's name, and they had made a claim for that policy.
The amount that you're looking for is $35,000?
That claimant was none other than Virginia McGinnis, the woman with whom Dina had spent her final hours. Just a day before Dina's death, Virginia had taken a $35,000 policy out on the young woman. The day after Dina's death, she had tried to cash in. In Keeney's mind, Dina's accidental tumble was swiftly transforming into something more sinister. But without a witness or a body, how could he distinguish between a tragic fall and a push?
Ask yourself, how do you prove someone was pushed off a cliff? Imagine you're standing at the edge of the cliff and you fall. Think of the injuries. You'll be battered, there'll be broken bones, there'll be bruises on your body will end up at the foot of the cliff. And now put yourself back at the cliff and imagine you're pushed. Same thing, right? Same bruises, same broken bones. Well, not quite.
The suspicion that Dina may have been shoved over the edge was a chilling hypothesis, but it was still just speculation. To prove any wrongdoing, Keeney needed evidence. He went back to basics, trying to learn more about Dina's relationship with the older couple. Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, the parents of one of Dina's friends, had taken her into their San Diego home after she was separated from her husband. Dina's loneliness was relieved in the fun-filled months she'd spent with her surrogate parents. She was known for her blind devotion to new friends. Had she been duped by the McGinnis' kindness? To check his suspicions, Keeney secured a copy of the autopsy report from the Monterey coroner's office. In the report, he noticed something unusual. A blood test revealed the presence of a drug called amitriptyline, commonly known as Elavil. The antidepressant had never been prescribed to Dina. It had, however, been prescribed to Virginia's husband, B.J. Toxicologist Catherine Ham retested a vial of Dina's blood that had been frozen after her autopsy. Her job was to check for levels of the drug. Keeney hoped that if a crime was committed, it could be proven in the lab.
I think that a lot of people that commit crimes underestimate what we can do in the laboratory.
To test for the presence of chemicals in the blood, Ham adds a solvent into the sample. The tube is rocked for 20 minutes as the drugs move out of the blood and into the solvent. The solvent is then removed from the tube and evaporated. The reconstituted solvent is injected into a gas chromatograph, an instrument that separates compounds according to their chemical properties. Ham compared the standard for the drug and the products of its breakdown with the chromatograph of Dina's blood. They matched. Having been frozen for so long, Dina's blood was degraded. Ham was unable to determine exactly when Dina had taken the drug, or exactly how much she'd taken. What she did know was that Dina Wilde had Elavil in her system when she died. With its disorienting and unpleasant side effects, it was hardly the kind of medication that Dina might have popped for a quick buzz. People taking the drug are usually stricken with weakness, nausea, and dizziness. These symptoms would be more pronounced in individuals who, like Dina, didn't take the medication on a regular basis. As he learned about Elavil's effects, Keeney realized that he needed to revise his image of Dina's last moments of life. If she'd been as queasy and unsteady as Ham suggested, she most likely would have slid down the mountain, not plunged. Though no crime scene photos had been taken, the period of time before the fall was well documented. Virginia had sent Dina's mother the roll of snapshots from the day of the accident as a gesture of condolence. Could these posed snapshots tell Keeney about the cause of Dina's death? At first glance, the 15 chronological pictures told the story of an average sightseeing junket. Dina seemed comfortable and happy as she posed for the camera. But as Keeney studied the pictures more carefully, he suspected that he was witnessing a murder plot.
The photograph of Virginia and B.J. McGinnis walking away from the car was taken by Dina Wilde, and it is a signature photo. It's at the cliff where she would die a few minutes later. It's when the Elavil has kicked in and she knows something's wrong. She's leaving a note to the rest of us that will survive her. It's like an assault victim who takes their own blood and writes the name of their assailant. She's pointing the finger.
The Elavil had clearly taken effect in the subsequent picture. Dina's bright eyes had grown dull. Her features slackened. She seemed unable to stand on her own.
That's great. 1, 2, 3.
When Keeney got to picture 11, the first thing that came to his mind was Dina knows. What at first seemed an innocuous cliffside stroll revealed upon closer examination the terrifying moment before Dina's death.
At that lip, you can see Dina's shoes pointing toward the boulders, in toward the road, but you can see her head in a blur, turning as she realizes her body is getting pushed that way. And as she looks, like you would if you were pushed, as she looks where she's going, the photo blurs. There are no features of her face at all. But her shoes still point to BJ, the guy she trusted.
Moments later, she would be dead. To Keeney's way of thinking, the bizarre and disturbing circumstances of Dina's death were leading to a single conclusion.
Once you know a 20-year-old dies with 55-year-old strangers at her side, and you know that those strangers bought a life insurance policy on her, in your heart, don't you believe that that's almost bound to be a murder?
Armed only with a handful of photos and a hunch, Keeney was a long way from proving murder. He knew he would need some help. In Louisville, Kentucky, Steve Keeney revisited Dina Wilde's autopsy report, looking for a shred of evidence to support his murder hypothesis. The Monterey coroner had determined the cause of Dina's death to be a skull fracture. He surmised that she lost her footing because of her high-heeled shoes. In his opinion, there was nothing suspicious about the circumstances of the so-called accident. Keeney wasn't so sure. He wondered if there was anything in the coroner's slim findings that suggested otherwise. Keeney brought the autopsy photos to forensic pathologist Barbara Weekly Jones. Could her analysis of the pictures differentiate a murder from an accident?
Steve Keeney was surprised when I told him some of the injuries were suggestive of not just an accidental death. Describe any on one hand.
The only fatal injury on Dina's body was a blow to the head, yet the right side of her body had linear scrape marks. To Weekly Jones, those lacerations suggested a limp slide, not a head-first plummet. Dina's bruised hands provided the most telling physical evidence. They hadn't sustained the kinds of injury typical in a fall. Her acrylic nails were snapped off, ragged, and embedded with granite, suggesting she'd clawed at the edge of the cliff, trying to save her life. Or perhaps she'd fought before she plunged to her death. In addition to the torn nails, both hands were marred by a very suspicious wound pattern.
But they had huge hematomas, black and blues, on the tops around her knuckles. Those you get when somebody steps on your hand, if you're holding the edge of a cliff.
Keeney wondered if Dina's broken skull was the result or the cause of her terrible fall. The top of the cliff sloped gently for the first few yards. If Dina had been trying to save herself, she no doubt would have grabbed at a rock or a tree root. But her palms showed no injuries, no signs of clutching at anything.
And look, she had fingernails. It looks like artificial fingernails.
Weekly Jones's findings substantiated Keeney's theory of an intentional push and a limp slide.
But that's not proof of homicide. So what else do you do? Well, the old phrase is, circumstances don't lie, people do.
There you go.
Keeney needed to take a close look at the suspects, Virginia and B.J. McGinnis.
Yeah. Well, they come up
Had
and
this
down
pleasant,
from
middle-aged
Mexico,
couple
from
really
October
plotted to
to
do away with Dina?
February.
Were they truly capable of pushing their young friend off a 600-foot cliff?
Yeah, they spawn. That's what they do. That's
As
a
he
good
probed
word
the
for it.
backgrounds of his prime suspects, Keeney uncovered a trail of death and deception. Virginia's rap sheet was a lot bloodier than Keeney had anticipated. Though the former nurse could affect a saccharine persona, her past suggested a cold, psychopathic profile that included compulsive lying, arson, and cruelty to animals. In addition to the accidental deaths of her daughter and second husband, Virginia's parents and several of her patients had died of unknown causes while in her charge. She frequently benefited from their life insurance policies. Keeney compiled this information into a lengthy report. It wasn't enough evidence to arrest Virginia and B.J. McGinnis, but it was enough to get the case reopened in California. Because the McGinnises had purchased Dina's insurance policy in San Diego, the district attorney's office in that jurisdiction became involved. Investigator Scott Lawrence took the baton from Steve Keeney. Like the Louisville attorney, he was compelled to make sense of Dina's fall. But Dina's case didn't have the benefit of much physical evidence. Lawrence attempted to disprove the theory of an accidental tumble by recreating Dina's trajectory. It was more than a year and a half after Dina's death, so any blood or geographic disturbance from her fall would have been washed away. The only thing Lawrence knew for sure was where she landed. What he needed to determine was where the fall started.
Well, one of the things that we had to look into was where we knew she was last standing at this turnout, almost within a few feet of where I'm at. That's based upon testimonial evidence as well as photographic.
Based on Lawrence's assessment, this wasn't a place where a person was likely to lose her footing, even in high-heeled shoes. The ground was relatively flat and solid. Now, Lawrence could recreate Dina's path down the cliff. Though he was a novice rock climber, his fierce commitment to the truth compelled him down the cliff face with a video camera in hand. From his topographic analysis, Lawrence believed that Dina was dead or near death when she lost her grip on the edge of the overlook. For one thing, the first section of the cliffside was not a sheer drop. Had Dina accidentally fallen here, she probably would have been able to stop her descent. She probably would have screamed. After the initial slope, the cliff drops off suddenly. Lawrence experimented to see how fast and by which route Dina was likely to have descended.
So we could take individual rocks and toss them down, and you get a pretty good idea of how you would accelerate once you got past the incline and once you made that first precipice about 40 or 50 feet down to my right, down toward the ocean.
Had Dina free-fallen off the precipice, she would have hit the bottom in excess of 120 miles per hour. Yet her body was in one piece, with no tumbling marks and relatively few fractures. Lawrence's research corroborated Weekly Jones's analysis of the body. Dina went down the cliff in a slow, limp slide, not an accelerating, high-speed tumble. Lawrence's careful recreation of the fall didn't jibe with the story relayed by the McGinnises.
So we tried many ways to interpret what could have happened, and the bottom line is there's always unknowns, and the people that know aren't talking.
By September of 1989, police gathered enough incriminating evidence to arrest the McGinnises. For the trial, the cliffside overlook was transformed into an outdoor courtroom. Scott Lawrence's careful recreation had a profound impact on the jury. The odyssey begun in Steve Keeney's office ended when the jury found Virginia McGinnis guilty of conspiracy, first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and murder for financial gain. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. B.J. McGinnis had died of pneumonia before the trial began. The inconsistencies in the so-called accidental death of Dina Hubbard Wilde had been untangled to reveal a cold-blooded murder, despite the fact that neither the body nor the crime scene had been preserved. For experts hoping to solve old murders, keen analysis of the meager traces left behind means the difference between overdue justice and a death that is forever lost in time. For 7 years, Susan Davis endured an unsatisfying marriage with a struggling insurance salesman named Ralph. Leaving was always on her mind, but she never got very far from their Columbia, Missouri home. Then, one evening in June 1985, after a long day at her secretarial job, she climbed into her Ford Escort and drove off, never to be seen again. When she failed to show up for work the next day or answer phone calls, her mother contacted the police. Officers from the Boone County Police Department questioned relatives and searched the Davis home, but found nothing to indicate that Susan had been taken against her will.
Yes, I'm so worried.
Some people believed Susan's departure was her way of making a clean break from a life that had gotten too painful and messy. At the time of her disappearance, Susan had finally succeeded in making some big changes. She'd separated from Ralph and sent her 2 children, Robbie and Angela, to live with her parents in Iowa.
And what was his occupation?
Perhaps she was starting her life over in some other part of the country. Captain Larry McCrae led the investigation.
Ralph Davis told us that when Susan disappeared that she had a boyfriend and she'd probably gone off to Texas and someday she'd show back up.
Susan was officially declared a missing person. In her absence, Ralph moved back into the house, brought his children home from their grandparents, and settled into the life of a single father. The family waited in vain for Susan's return. As his finances dwindled, Ralph went to court to make sure that if Susan did resurface, she'd be compelled to pay him child support. But there were still no clues as to her whereabouts and diminishing hope that she'd ever return. But as McCrae came to realize, Ralph Davis's victimized spouse routine was a feeble charade. The more he probed police files, the more McCrae came to realize what an abusive husband Ralph had been. For the duration of their marriage, Susan had lived in the wake of Ralph's ferocity. Then, one night in 1985, a few months before her disappearance, she'd reached the breaking point. Fearing for her life and the safety of her children, she garnered the strength to call the police. Ralph was arrested.
We investigated a case where Ralph had beat her up. We'd photographed, and at that time, there was an ex parte on her, which says, Ralph, you cannot go back to your home. You have to stay away from Susan and the kids.
A short stay in jail did little to calm Ralph. He had been boiling mad when he was released on bail. Then Susan disappeared. Ralph's violent tendencies gave credence to the theory that Susan had left him and covered her trail to ensure her safety. But for McCrae, the pieces still weren't adding up. Why hadn't this devoted mother contacted her children? Why hadn't she checked in with her frantic mother to let her know that she was all right? McCrae suspected he was looking at something more ominous than a woman in search of a happier life. McCrae believed that Ralph Davis wasn't telling the whole story. But without any evidence, the police had no course of action. There was no body. There were no leads. Even Susan's car had disappeared. McCrae's only option was to dig in and hope that one day a clue would surface. He didn't imagine that the waiting game would play out for so long. It had been 2 years since Susan Davis climbed into her car and vanished. Whether she left town intentionally or met a horrible fate remained an unanswered question. Captain McCrae's investigation met a dead end. Then one day, the owner of a storage facility took the locks off a unit rented by a customer who'd stopped paying his bills. Inside was a Ford Escort with the driver's side window blown in. The name of the delinquent customer was none other than Ralph Davis.
That's McCrae.
Captain McCrae was contacted. A quick run of the vehicle ID and tags confirmed it was Davis's car. McCrae took a look inside and was struck with a terrible sight.
When we approach the car and we look inside of it, we're pretty sure that somebody died in that car.
Blood and tissue spattered the dashboard, seats, and visors. Glass shards mingled with spent bullet shells on the car floor. 2 feeble air fresheners added a grim irony to the grisly scene. After 2 years of sitting on his hands, McCrae could finally move in on his prime suspect, Ralph Davis. Davis came up with a story to explain away the car. Before blowing out of town, he said, Susan had paid him one last visit. She was armed. Ralph overpowered her, pulled her out of the car, and climbed behind the wheel. As he drove away, he claimed, Susan smashed the window with her arm, bloodying the glass. The implausible account did little to explain how bits of body tissue got into the car. Davis was arrested. Experience told McCrae that he'd just detained a brutal murderer, but proving that in court would be another matter, especially when the crime scene was 2 years old. A successful forensic investigation would take a two-pronged approach. First, McCrae's team would have to establish that a murder had in fact taken place in the car, and secondly, they'd have to identify the victim. McCrae believed he was looking at the remains of Susan Davis, but he was a long way from proving it. From the pattern of blood in the car, preliminary crime scene reconstruction determined that the victim had been shot inside the vehicle.
On the floor of the car, we found glass, basically moving inward, which would indicate that a shot or something had gone through that and from the outside. As we looked at the glass, we found that the glass was on the floorboard, and on top of the glass was blood.
It seemed that the shot came through the window, striking the driver in the head. The force sent the victim toward the other side of the car, crashing first into the rearview mirror hard enough to crack the windshield. From the amount of blood and brain tissue found in the car, the medical examiner determined that someone had died here. The automobile was towed to a private storage lot where McCrae's team could try to make sense of the disarray. Because they didn't know what was evidence, they erred on the side of caution and collected everything.
Do you see, is there something back over, see back over?
Armed with specialized tools, apparel, and collection bottles, the investigators began to take the car apart, piece by piece, carefully cataloging each fragment of bone, tissue, and each smear of blood. Bullets were dislodged from the interior of the car. They matched shotgun shells found in Ralph Davis's home. A vacuum with sterile filters was used to collect the tiniest pieces of evidence. Like high-tech car vandals, the team stripped the escort down to the bare bones, bagging everything from the steering wheel to the carpeting for further analysis. At the University of Missouri's Human Skeletal ID Lab, bits of debris, some metal, some glass, some unidentified, were delivered in a matchbox to anthropologist Sam Stout. If human bone fragments were present in the jumbled findings, Stout would know how to unlock their secrets.
My work as an anthropologist was probably important in this case because as anthropologists we're often called upon to analyze bone specimens. We're probably the most familiar with pieces of bone, fragments of bone, whether it be a 2 million year old fossil to a modern cemetery.
33 fragments, none longer than a quarter inch, were separated into little plastic caps.
Bone specimens to embed in plastic, and then we'll...
Because the findings were so small, it was nearly impossible to determine by sight whether they were bone. To be sure, Stout needed to examine the samples under a microscope. First, they needed to be prepared for viewing. To make slides, Stout's assistant embeds each fragment in plastic. As the air in the vacuum chamber is drawn away, the plastic impregnates the sample, then hardens. The embedded specimen is cut into slices as thin as cellophane. Each slice is then smoothed and placed on a glass slide for viewing. Microscopic analysis of the cross-sections told Stout that he was, in fact, looking at human bone. Stout knew where the fragments came from, a human skull. Dr. Stout had determined that the meager scrapings from the floor of Susan Davis's car were in fact human facial bones. Now he wanted to see if there was anything unique about the bone fragments that could tie them to Susan Davis and her death. Stout noticed that there were some smudges on the bone fragments. He sent them to the geology department at the University of Missouri lab. A scanning electron microscope revealed that traces of lead had been embedded in the bone. The presence of antimony indicated that gunpowder was involved as well. This victim had been shot. The close scrutiny of these fragments was turning the cloudy details into a vivid portrait of murder. But how could Stout link the bone to Susan Davis? Stout noticed an odd characteristic. Beyond the lead smudges was another lighter discoloration in the bone. In Stout's experience, that pattern indicated that the victim had been taking tetracycline. To test for the antibiotic, he exposed the bone to fluorescent light. If the drug were present, the bone would glow.
We saw the actual fluorescing of tetracycline, and upon seeing that, I suggested that they examine the records to see if Susan Davis had a prescription for tetracycline.
Dr. Stout estimated that the victim had been taking the drug for at least 3 months before death. McCrae knew from the original search of Susan's home that she'd been prescribed tetracycline at the time of her death. Stout had shown that the remains in the car were from the face of a person who was taking tetracycline. But McCrae needed irrefutable proof that this was Susan Davis. Without it, Ralph Davis would likely go free.
The missing link was, whose body was it? We all felt that it was Susan, but that's not evidence that you can take to court.
No murderer in the state of Missouri had ever been convicted without a body, so McCrae had a double burden. Before he could prove that Ralph Davis was a killer, he'd have to prove that Susan Davis was the victim. The finishing touches of the investigation would have to be drawn in blood. Could bloodstains link a 2-year-old crime scene to the death of Susan Davis? It was forensic serologist Lori Maloney's job to find out. Carpeting, sun visors, and upholstery from the interior of the car were sent to her at the Missouri State Highway Patrol lab. If she could determine that blood on these items came from Susan Davis, it would be nearly impossible for Ralph Davis to evade prosecution. But, as Maloney knew, irrefutable victim identification is tricky business. She needed to run a series of tests to find out exactly whose blood this was. Above all, she needed to be precise, to check and cross-check her results. Maloney's first task was to swab the samples to make sure that the stains found in the car were truly blood. The test turns green when blood is present. Maloney then needed to confirm that the blood was human. She added human antibody to the samples. When human blood and human antibody come in contact, they react, forming a thin white line. Maloney's results were consistent with McCrae's theory that someone had been killed in the vehicle.
I found on the evidence human blood detected on the carpeting and the seat belt latches. Also, I found human protein on the sun visors.
But how could she prove that the remains had come from Susan Davis? She had no samples of Susan's blood or tissue to compare them with. Paternity tests are commonly used to establish a man's parenthood by comparing his DNA with that of the child and its mother. By applying that standard procedure in a creative new way, a reverse paternity test, Maloney hoped to simulate Susan Davis's genetic profile. Every child gets half his DNA from his mother, half from his father. Subtracting DNA bands that the father and child have in common leaves a barcode representing the mother's genetic signature.
The remaining bands would then be used to compare to the crime scene evidence, and if those were matching to the crime scene evidence, the blood could have originated from the mother, Susan Davis.
Using this procedure, Ralph Davis's DNA pattern was subtracted from his children's. The resulting bands were a close simulation of Susan Davis's genetic fingerprint. This banding pattern matched the samples found on the Ford Escort's carpet. Susan Davis had been killed in her car. The ghostly fingerprint of a woman who'd vanished years earlier was returning to solve her murder.
What I think happened to Susan Davis was that she was going to leave this area to some safe haven because of Ralph's harassing her, stalking, and she was packing her car, backed up to the front of the house, loading her clothes in it when Ralph came around the house. She saw Ralph, got in the car, locked it up, and Ralph came up and shot her through the driver's side window.
Thanks to astute forensic analysis and an exacting recreation of the grisly death scene, prosecutors convinced the jury that Ralph Davis had killed his estranged wife in her car. It was a landmark decision in Missouri, one that saw Ralph Davis get the death penalty, even though the whereabouts of his victim is a mystery to this day. In the Susan Davis case, investigators had to revisit a crime that happened 2 years earlier without the benefit of a body. In Canada, investigators faced a similar but even stranger challenge: to determine what killed a woman 3,000 years ago. They had the body, but to touch it would be to destroy it. At the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, a mummy named Jedame-Sank, or Jed, has stood in silent vigil for decades. Her secrets wrapped tightly inside her delicate sarcophagus. Museum visitors and scientists alike are fascinated by her mysterious beauty and eager to know more about how she lived and died. From the elaborate drawings on her cartonnage, the shell of linen and glue in which her mummy is encased, we know only scattered details of her life. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Jed, a musician at the Temple Amun-Re, lived a prosperous life on the east bank of the Nile.
The soul that she will not want.
Ancient Egyptians celebrated life after death, but it could only be attained if they departed this world in the prescribed fashion. The journey to the land of the gods would be strenuous and dangerous. In order for the soul to survive the trip, the body needed to be strong. Mummification was the answer. A marriage of science and religion, the mummification process followed a strictly detailed procedure that took approximately 10 weeks to complete. After death, the body was cleansed and anointed. A single slit was made in the abdomen. Then the internal organs were removed and preserved in jars. Natron, a powdery drying agent made up of salt and sand, was heaped over the body. In the arid heat of the Egyptian sun, the body would completely desiccate in 40 days. The skin was rubbed with oils and resin to keep it supple. Linen stuffing was inserted in the body cavities to maintain lifelike contours. The corpse was adorned with makeup and funerary jewelry. Then the arduous task of wrapping began. In an effort to know more about these ancient people, many researchers, like pediatrician Peter Lewin, have found themselves compelled to unwrap the mysterious packages.
In the olden days, we would break up this casket, tear off the bandages of the individual inside who's mummified, break up the tissues to examine genetic material, chemistry, and any diseases, and in essence destroy a mummy, which is invaluable to humanity.
Lewin grew up in Egypt and has maintained a lifelong fascination with mummies. Today, in addition to his work at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, he is a leading researcher in the field of paleopathology.
Paleopathology is really the study of diseases of ancient man, and that can be done by examining the bodies themselves, and also can be done by the latest use of X-ray technology.
How could Dr. Lewin see into the life of this mummy and learn why she died without desecrating the sanctity of her death? X-ray technology, known as computerized axial tomography, or CT scanning, was the answer to Lewin's dilemma. The machine produces cross-sectional images of the body without touching it. When the slices are stacked together, a three-dimensional image is rendered. Dr. Lewin was assisted by CT technician Stephanie Holoka. Lewin, who pioneered the use of the technique to slice into mummies without using a knife, first scanned Jed in 1978. But the technology was in its infancy, and he was barely able to distinguish the ancient body from the dense packing material. Nearly 20 years later, he was ready to try again. Because the patient was already dead, Holoka didn't need to worry about radiation levels. That freedom enabled her to take numerous pictures at very small increments. She scanned the body in 5mm slices and went to 3mm increments for the head and neck. Even greater detail was used to image the ears and eyes. 300 two-dimensional images were taken during the 4 hours of scanning. Glimpses of Jed came through in these X-rays, but it wouldn't be until they were stacked together that the ancient woman would truly come to life. Once the meticulous scanning was completed, it was finally time for the mummy to show herself. A computer compiled the pictures into a 3D rendering, but the quality was poor. In living patients, bone is dense and shows up white. Fat, flesh, and skin are gray. Liquid is black. In Jed's body, the bones had lost minerals and become softer, while the soft tissue had toughened. Instead of a high-contrast image, Jed was showing up only in shades of gray. This low-contrast problem meant that Holoka would have to painstakingly render the images slice by slice. Imaging the skull in a live patient takes 10 minutes. It took Holoka 3 hours to reconstruct Jed's skull and hundreds of hours to render the entire body. Holoka was then able to electronically peel away the layers. After removing the outermost layer of cartilage, she arrived at the linen wrapping that surrounded the head. Gray circles showed up over the eye sockets. The Egyptians inserted plates behind the lids to keep the features from sinking. Holoka also noticed that in keeping with the ritual, Jed's brain had been removed and her skull stuffed with linen. Finally, the image of a small, young woman appeared. Based on the pattern of bone fusion, Jed was estimated to be 30 to 35 years old when she died.
And the first thing I thought when I saw her skull, after doing a lot of 3D imaging on various skulls, is that she must have been a very pretty lady. She had very high cheekbones and she had a very well-defined chin.
Holoka had used CT technology to excavate the mummy. Now, Lewin wanted to know what killed her. Could he determine cause of death 3,000 years after the fact? Lewin examined the 3D image of Jed's skull. He noticed a strange black shape on the left jawbone. The gaping hole, he realized, was an enormous abscess. Hard as it is to believe, Jed had died from dental disease. Ancient Egyptians were prone to dental disease because of their sandy, coarse diet and their love for sweets. In Jed's case, the outer enamel on 24 of her 28 teeth had worn away, exposing the sensitive dental pulp and the root. Exposed roots are acutely painful. They also become infected easily. Jed's infection was spread from the root canal to the bone, where it caused several abscesses. Lewin surmised that the large pus-filled cyst probably burst, spreading infection throughout her body and poisoning her blood. It was probably an agonizingly painful, drawn-out death.
She probably died a very, very miserable death due to genital infection, which originated from this basically dental abscess of her left upper jaw.
In life, this beautiful musician from Thebes endured agonizing pain. In death, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Dr. Lewin's team, she has finally achieved the kind of celebrated and dignified afterlife her culture held so dearly.
With this type of imaging, really, we have pioneered the use of that sort of technology which is non-destructive and which gives us tremendous information in relation to diseases of ancient man.
Because Djerame had been so carefully preserved, time didn't stand in the way of science. Detectives who lure truth from the murky past are constantly fighting against the ravages of time. Today, science is their greatest ally in that battle. Armed with the latest techniques, forensics experts are winning the war against time, liberating lost and forgotten voices from beyond the grave.